The island of Capri is a jewel of the Mediterranean, a jagged crown of limestone rising from the turquoise depths of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Today, tourists walk its sun-drenched paths, breathing in the scent of lemon trees and salt air. But in the twilight of the 1st century, Capri was not a paradise. It was a tomb. At the summit sat the Villa Jovis, the Villa of Jupiter, where the Emperor Tiberius retreated to escape the prying eyes of Rome. He was a man who had conquered kingdoms but lost his soul to the shadows. Behind those marble walls, the sun didn't shine. There, the most powerful man on earth practiced a brand of cruelty so profound it forced the historians of the time to lower their quills in shame. We are going to step into the darkness of that villa, not as guests, but as witnesses to the nightmare of those who had no voice. The island of Capri stands as a haunting silhouette against the Mediterranean horizon, a place where natural beauty once masked the darkest impulses of the Roman soul. To understand the horror that unfolded within the Villa Jovis, one must first visualize the geography of this limestone fortress rising sharply from the sea. It was not merely a retreat for an aging ruler. It was a psychological weapon designed to isolate the victims from the reach of Roman law. Tiberius chose this jagged rock specifically because its sheer cliffs offered no path for escape and no witnesses for the condemned. The winding, narrow trails that led to the summit were guarded by praetorians who owed their lives to the emperor alone. Within this gilded cage, the screams of the innocent were effortlessly swallowed by the howling coastal winds and the crashing waves. The physical isolation of the island served as a constant reminder to the enslaved that the world had forgotten them. Tiberius transformed the natural splendor of the island into a labyrinth of calculated terror where every cave and grotto served a twisted purpose. The Villa Jovis was perched on the highest point, a massive complex of marble and stone that loomed over the abyss like a predator. For the young slaves brought there, the sight of the jagged coastline was their last glimpse of a reality that held any hope. Once they crossed the threshold of the imperial estate, they entered a realm where the sun only served to illuminate their shame. The architecture itself was designed to facilitate the emperor's voyeurism, with hidden corridors and viewing platforms that allowed him to watch his subjects. Every corner of the estate was a stage for a man who had grown weary of conventional power and sought godhood through cruelty. The island's beauty became a cruel irony, a masterpiece of nature serving as the backdrop for a masterpiece of human depravity. The atmosphere of Capri during the reign of Tiberius was heavy with the scent of sea salt and the pervasive chill of fear. To the young boys and girls trapped there, the island was a universe unto itself, governed by the whims of a single rotting mind. There was no appeal to the Senate here, no protective hand of a father, and no sanctuary within the temples of the gods. Tiberius had successfully severed the island from the morality of the continent, creating a microstate where the laws of humanity were suspended. The very geography of the cliffs meant that the only way off the island was through the emperor's permission or a fatal plunge. This suffocating sense of entrapment was the foundation of the trauma inflicted upon those who were forced to serve him. They were surrounded by the vast open sea, yet they were more imprisoned than if they had been kept in the deepest dungeons. Historians suggest that Tiberius's choice of Capri was a deliberate act of architectural and geographical misanthropy meant to hide his physical and moral decay. As his face became ravaged by disease and his mind by paranoia, he sought a place where his reflection was the only one that mattered. The young slaves were not just victims of his lust, but witnesses to a man who had completely surrendered to his own internal demons. He viewed the island as a private laboratory where he could experiment with the limits of human endurance and the fragility of innocence. The limestone caves, once sacred to ancient spirits, were repurposed as chambers for the most unspeakable acts ever recorded in the Roman annals. Every luxury provided by the villa, the heated baths, the fine wines, the silken robes, was stained by the knowledge of what occurred in the shadows. The island's isolation ensured that the emperor's descent into madness remained a secret, whispered only by the waves. The transition from the vibrant life of Rome to the static, terrifying silence of Capri was a death sentence in all but name for the enslaved. They were stripped of their names and identities, becoming mere numbers in a catalogue of flesh designed to satisfy a man who could no longer feel. The beauty of the Mediterranean sunsets offered no comfort when one knew the night would bring fresh terrors under the flicker of oil lamps. Tiberius's presence on the island turned a place of healing into a place of profound psychological and physical desecration for all who entered. The minnows and the spintriae lived in a state of perpetual hypervigilance, knowing that a single misplaced glance could lead them to the cliffs. The island was a pressure cooker of dread, where the emperor's boredom was more dangerous than his anger, leading to ever more inventive cruelties. It was a fortress of silence where the only sound louder than the wind was the heartbeat of the terrified. Ultimately, the legacy of Capri under Tiberius serves as a grim testament to what happens when absolute power is insulated from the eyes of the world. The island remains a monument to the victims who never left its shores, their stories etched into the very rocks that witnessed their suffering. Even today, the ruins of the Villa Jovis carry an aura of unease, a lingering shadow that the brightest Italian summer cannot fully dispel. We must look at the geography of this place not as a vacation destination, but as the site of a historic atrocity. The cliffs, the grottos, and the sea are the silent keepers of secrets that Roman historians could only hint at with trembling hands. To tell the story of the slaves of Capri is to acknowledge the depth of the abyss that Tiberius created on his island. It was a hell of his own making, and for the young ones trapped within it, there was no light until the end. Gemini said. The horror intensified within the sapphire waters of the island's secluded sea caves where Tiberius staged his most aquatic nightmares. These grottos, carved by the relentless tides into the limestone foundations of Capri, became the primary setting for a predatory game. The emperor, despite his advancing age and physical deformities, spent hours swimming in these subterranean chambers alongside his pisciculi, or little minnows. This was not the innocent recreation of a statesman, but a highly choreographed and deeply perverse theater of absolute domination. The young boys were forced to dive deep into the cold currents, emerging only to perform acts of servitude. They were treated as if they were nothing more than schools of fish, lacking any human rights or agency. In these light-starved caverns, the boundary between the natural world and the emperor's twisted imagination completely dissolved into the dark. The training for these minnows was as rigorous as it was dehumanizing, intended to strip away every shred of their modesty. These children were selected for their agility and their ability to remain underwater for extended periods while catering to his whims. Tiberius demanded that they dart between his legs and use their mouths to satisfy his base urges while submerged. To the emperor, the struggle for breath that the boys experienced only added to the thrill of his control. The water served to muffle their protests and hide the reality of the crimes from the world above the waves. Every splash in the grotto was a rhythmic reminder that their very air was a gift from a tyrant. They were forced to adapt to an amphibious existence, living half in the water and half in terror. If a boy showed any hesitation or failed to perform with the requisite enthusiasm, the consequences were immediate and often fatal. Tiberius was known for his hair-trigger temper, which was only exacerbated by the isolation and the rotting state of his mind. A child who surfaced too early for air might find himself pulled back down by the guards or the emperor. The grotto's walls, slick with moss and salt, offered no handhold for those trying to escape the predatory reach of Rome. Death in the water was a silent affair, witnessed only by the other terrified children who were forced to watch. The minnows understood that their survival depended entirely on their ability to please a man who viewed them as property. This aquatic prison was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, ensuring that even the act of breathing was tied to submission. The physical toll on these young slaves was immense, as they spent hours shivering in the damp, sunless environment of the caves. Their skin would prune and their bodies would ache from the cold, yet they were required to maintain a facade. Tiberius viewed their physical suffering as a form of art, finding beauty in the blue-tinted lips and trembling limbs of youth. He would often have them pose in the shallow water, mimicking the statues of Neptune or other sea deities. This aestheticization of pain was a hallmark of his reign on Capri, turning human beings into living, breathing sculptures. The salt air that tourists today find refreshing was, to them, the stinging scent of an inescapable and watery tomb. There was no warmth to be found in the emperor's presence, only the cold calculation of a lifelong predator. Beyond the physical acts themselves, the pisciculi were subjected to a total erasure of their past lives and their names. They were no longer the sons of Roman citizens or foreign captives. They were merely the emperor's collection of sea creatures. This psychological breaking was essential to the emperor's enjoyment, as he sought to be the sole master of their reality. By forcing them into these aquatic roles, he removed them from the context of human society and civilization. The grottos became a world where the only law was the current and the only god was Tiberius. He would often boast of his minnows to his few guests, treating the children as if they were prize catches. The dehumanization was so complete that many of the survivors were left permanently scarred by the experience. As the years passed, the stories of the minnows became a dark legend that whispered through the narrow streets of Rome. People spoke in hushed tones of the emperor who had traded his throne for a grotto and his soldiers for children. The grotesque nature of these events served to alienate Tiberius even further from the Roman people he was meant to lead. It highlighted the terrifying truth that when a man has everything, he may seek the one thing he shouldn't have. The grottos of Capri remain today, beautiful and serene, yet they carry the weight of these ancient, watery crimes. To look into those blue depths is to look into the very abyss of the human soul. The pisciculi are gone, but the echo of their struggle for air still haunts the limestone halls of history. The depravity of Tiberius did not stop at the water's edge. It moved inland into the flickering torchlight of the villa. Within the opulent halls of his Capri estate, he curated a specialized group of victims known as the spintriae. These were not mere servants, but children and young adults forced into a grotesque form of living choreography. The emperor had become a connoisseur of the obscene, demanding that these youths arrange themselves in intricate patterns. He sought to transform human flesh into static scenery, treating his slaves as if they were nothing more than decorative furniture. This psychological transformation of people into objects was the core of his daily entertainment during his final years. Each arrangement was a calculated insult to the dignity of the human form, designed to satisfy a dying man's boredom. To achieve his vision of a living hell, Tiberius forced these youths into triple-layered chains of intertwined bodies. These were not random acts of cruelty, but meticulously rehearsed displays of forced intimacy and physical degradation. The emperor would sit in his ivory chair, watching as the young slaves moved in synchronization to his commands. He viewed these human clusters as aesthetic triumphs, ignoring the stifled sobs and the trembling of exhausted limbs. For those caught in the chains, the experience was a total dissolution of the self into a mass of meat. They were stripped of their individuality, becoming mere links in a sequence of flesh that existed only for him. The marble floors of the villa became a stage for a play where the actors were also the prisoners. The atmosphere in these chambers was thick with the scent of expensive incense and the heavy dread of the participants. Tiberius surrounded himself with these spintriae, even during his meals, using them as living props for his guests. He would often lecture on art and philosophy while the most horrific acts were performed just inches from his table. This juxtaposition of high culture and low morality was a deliberate choice by the emperor to mock the gods. He wanted to prove that on Capri, his will was the only law that dictated the movement of bodies. The young slaves were forced to maintain their poses for hours, their muscles screaming under the weight of others. Any slip in performance was met with immediate punishment from the guards who stood silhouetted against the villa's walls. Beyond the physical strain, Tiberius engaged in a form of mythological role-play that added a layer of insanity. He dressed the boys and girls as satyrs and nymphs, forcing them to reenact scenes from ancient, lustful legends. The villa's groves and gardens were turned into a perverse Eden where innocence was hunted as a sport. By forcing these children to adopt the personas of mythical creatures, he further separated them from their humanity. They were no longer the children of Rome's enemies or the unlucky victims of the slave markets. They were characters in a tragedy written by a man who had lost his grip on reality. This theatrical cruelty ensured that the victims felt they were part of a nightmare from which there was no waking. The recruitment for the spintriae was a terrifying process that reached into every corner of the Roman Empire's vast holdings. Tiberius had scouts who looked for specific physical traits, viewing children as one might view a collection of rare gems. Once brought to the island, these youths were subjected to a rigorous education in the emperor's specific brand of vice. They were taught to suppress their own emotions and desires, becoming empty vessels for the emperor's projected fantasies. This systematic breaking of the will was a slow, agonizing process that often took months of isolation and threats. By the time they entered the emperor's presence, they were shells of their former selves, moving with a hollow grace. The psychological toll of this existence was a burden that few, if any, could ever hope to recover from. As Tiberius aged, his demands for more elaborate and disturbing living ornaments only grew in their scope and frequency. The halls of the Villa Jovis became a labyrinth of human suffering that was hidden away from the light. Even the elite members of his court were often disgusted by the sights they were forced to witness. Yet, no one dared to speak against the man who held the power of life and death. The spintriae remained the silent witnesses to the rotting heart of the Roman Empire's leadership on that rock. Their stories were eventually carried back to the mainland by servants and soldiers, fueling the dark legend of Capri. Today, the empty ruins of the villa stand as a skeleton of the place where human beings were once furniture. Gemini said, "The pinnacle of the emperor's terror was reached at the terrifying height of the limestone precipices overlooking the sea. For those who had outlived their utility or sparked a moment of imperial boredom, the cliffs were the end." Tiberius used the natural elevation of the island to create a spectacle of gravity that silenced all internal dissent. The leap of death was not a quick execution, but a drawn-out psychological torture that began long before the edge. Victims were marched up the winding paths, sensing the air grow colder as they neared the sky. The sheer drops of Capri provided a dramatic finality that no dungeon on the mainland could ever match. To the emperor, the beauty of the fall was just another form of high-stakes entertainment. The site itself was a jagged protrusion of rock that seemed to hang precariously over the churning white foam. Tiberius would often sit in a specially designed chair near the edge to observe the faces of the condemned. He took a predatory delight in watching the transition from desperate pleading to the silent acceptance of the inevitable. The soldiers would hold the victims at the very brink, forcing them to look down at the jagged rocks. This agonizing weight was designed to break the spirit before the body was ever touched by the wind. The sound of the waves crashing hundreds of feet below served as a rhythmic death knell for the youth. In this high-altitude theater, the emperor played the role of a god deciding the fate of mortals. When the command was finally given, the act of falling was only the first stage of the execution's design. As the body plummeted through the air, it became a focal point for the spectators watching from the villa. The fall was a chaotic blur of limbs and white fabric against the backdrop of the deep blue sea. Tiberius believed that the terror of the descent was a fitting punishment for any perceived slight or failure. There was no mercy to be found in the wind, only the cold gravity of a tyrant's whim. The victims were denied the dignity of a grave, their lives extinguished in a public display of power. This was the ultimate expression of the emperor's ownership over the lives and deaths of his slaves. The cruelty did not end when the body struck the surface of the water with a sickening impact. Stationed in the waves below were small boats filled with marines armed with heavy oars and sharp hooks. These men were not there to rescue the fallen, but to ensure that the job was finished. If a victim miraculously survived the fall, they were beaten and prodded back under the water until they drowned. The oars would rise and fall in a rhythmic violence, turning the water red around the broken bodies. This secondary layer of execution ensured that there was absolutely no possibility of survival for the emperor's targets. It was a closed loop of destruction that left no room for hope or even a miracle. The psychological impact on the remaining slaves who witnessed these leaps was a crucial part of the island's control. They knew that their lives hung by a thread as thin as the emperor's changing moods and dark impulses. The cliffs were a constant visual reminder of the price of a single mistake or a lost grace. This pervasive fear ensured a level of obedience that went far beyond what simple chains could ever achieve. The guards themselves were hardened by the frequency of these events, becoming extensions of the emperor's own cold apathy. Every splash in the distance was a signal to those left behind that their turn could be next. The island's beauty was forever marred by the knowledge of what lay at the base of the rocks. Today, the Salto di Tiberio remains one of the most chilling landmarks on the island of Capri for modern visitors. The ruins of the structures where Tiberius once sat are still visible, weathered by centuries of salt and sun. It is a place where the wind seems to carry the echoes of the terrified screams of the past. The sheer scale of the drop is enough to turn the stomach of even the most casual of tourists. It stands as a monument to the absolute limit of what a man can do when unrestrained. The leap of death was the final, tragic punctuation mark on the lives of those who suffered there. In the history of Roman cruelty, few places hold a shadow as long as these sun-bleached cliffs. The death of Tiberius in the spring of 37 AD brought a visceral sense of relief to a world that had held its breath. As word of his passing spread from the cliffs of Capri to the bustling heart of the Roman Forum, the atmosphere shifted from terror to a desperate, vengeful joy. The people did not cry for their fallen leader. Instead, they chanted for his body to be dragged through the mud and thrown into the Tiber. This final rejection was the public's answer to the years of silence and seclusion he had imposed from his island fortress. His death was shrouded in the same darkness that had defined his life, with rumors suggesting he was smothered by his own successor. The man who had lived as an untouchable god died as a frail old man, terrified and alone. Even in his final moments, the shadow of his crimes on Capri loomed over the imperial legacy. The legacy of Tiberius is a haunting case study in the absolute rot that occurs when power is divorced from accountability. By retreating to Capri, he created a vacuum where his worst impulses could flourish without the stabilizing influence of the Roman Senate. He proved that a ruler's private character is inseparable from their public duty, as his personal depravity eventually paralyzed the state. The stories of the minnows and the leaps became a cautionary tale for every emperor who would follow in his blood-stained footsteps. History remembers him not for the borders he secured, but for the innocence he systematically destroyed within his marble walls. His reign serves as a permanent scar on the narrative of Western civilization, a reminder of the abyss within us. We must look at his life as a warning of how easily a protector can become a predator. The physical ruins of the Villa Jovis today serve as a silent, skeletal witness to the atrocities that were once common knowledge. Tourists who wander through the crumbled peristyles often feel an inexplicable heaviness in the air, a residue of the island's dark past. Nature has slowly reclaimed the stone, but the history of the site remains resistant to the cleansing effects of time. The grottos where the children once swam are now picturesque landmarks, yet they carry a chilling echo for those who know the truth. It is a place where the contrast between the sublime beauty of the earth and the ugliness of man is most visible. The stones do not speak, but they hold the memory of every scream that was lost to the Mediterranean wind. Capri is a beautiful grave, a place where the ghosts of the enslaved still linger in the shadows. In the centuries following his death, Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus struggled to find words that could accurately capture his cruelty. They wrote with a mixture of disgust and fascination, ensuring that the names of his victims were never entirely erased from the record. While we may never know the specific names of every boy and girl who suffered on the island, their collective tragedy is immortalized. By documenting these horrors, the ancient world sought to provide a form of posthumous justice for those who had no voice in life. The narrative of the monster of Capri became a tool for moral education, teaching future generations about the dangers of tyranny. To forget these stories would be to allow Tiberius to win his battle against the humanity of his subjects. We tell these stories today to honor the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of absolute darkness. The psychological impact of Tiberius's reign also fundamentally changed the way the Roman people viewed the institution of the Principate. The realization that a single man could turn a paradise into a slaughterhouse broke the religious illusion of the emperor's divinity. It fostered a deep-seated cynicism within the Roman soul that would eventually contribute to the slow decline of the empire itself. If the leader of the world could be a predator of children, then the moral foundation of Rome was built on shifting sand. This loss of faith was perhaps the most enduring damage Tiberius inflicted upon the civilization he was meant to preserve. The island of Capri became a symbol of the other, a place where the civilized world ended and madness began. It was a dark mirror reflecting the potential for evil that exists when a human is granted total liberty. As we conclude this journey into the darkness of Capri, we are left with the image of a man who had everything and chose nothingness. Tiberius had the wealth of nations and the loyalty of legions, yet he spent his final days hunting children in the surf. His life is a testament to the fact that power without purpose leads only to the most profound forms of self-destruction. The victims of Capri are the silent protagonists of this history, their suffering the only thing that gives the story any meaning. We must remember them as more than just footnotes in the biography of a tyrant, but as individuals whose lives were stolen. Their legacy is our awareness, a commitment to ensuring that such shadows are never allowed to grow unchecked again. The sun still sets over the Salto di Tiberio, but the light now serves to reveal the truth.